This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hi, I'm Melissa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life, and I am joined today by Nick Lusontag, a Senior Manager on our sustainability team. So today, the story that we want to talk to you all about is EPA's new proposed rule on power plant emissions. And now these came out last Thursday. There's been a lot of media coverage about them prior to them coming out, but actually not too much coverage on them since they've come out. So we want to give you a little bit of a rundown on what these rules are, the projected impact, and some of the fine line details. So at a very top level, the headline here is great news. The EPA has released a final or a proposed draft, and that draft is for power plant emissions, and it's their most stringent standard in the history of power plant emissions in the US. Now, as drafted, the rule is poised to achieve over 75% reductions from the power sector by 2030. And that's really significant. And while that's just shy, it's pretty close to the Biden administration's goal, which is to have an 80% renewable grid by 2030 and net zero by 2035. So, what is this rule? There's a 168-page document for anybody that's interested in reading it. And there's essentially 5 specific emission reduction standards across a few different types of plants. So think new plants, existing plants, coal-fired plants, gas-fired plants. And some of the details here and some of the standards that were written in is that new and existing gas plants would need to reduce 90% of their emissions by 2035 or run on hydrogen by 2038. Now, existing coal-fired plants, of which we have a lot in this country, would need to hit that 90% target by 2030, but only if they intend to remain operational by 2040. So plants that are planning on decommissioning by that time don't need to apply or don't need to meet this standard. So some of the nuance or some of the important things to understand about this rule is that it's technically technology agnostic in terms of how to achieve these reductions. But the EPA is actually basing these reductions on what is achievable through carbon capture storage, or CCS. And that's because the EPA is technically required in their standards to base those reductions on what are called proven technologies on what's achievable. And so that's why CCS is kind of the base technology that was used in a lot of this drafting. And so this is what's really important about this is that this is not a mandate to transition to renewable sources. And that was, in fact, the premise of the proposed Clean Power Plan of 2022 that SCOTUS ruled down, essentially saying you can't mandate that we have to shift to renewables. So what's really meaningful about this plan is that here we see the EPA is trying to achieve the same really ambitious reductions, but through a much more flexible tactic.
Yeah, and so this is basically the Biden administration's response to that Supreme Court ruling last summer. Um, you know, Part of the Supreme Court's ruling was that you can't, as you said, you can't regulate. You can regulate individual technologies basically to make them more efficient, but by basing your transition on moving entirely to renewables, you're not regulating an individual technology anymore. You're basically outlawing an existing one. You're outlawing fossil fuels. And so this is the Biden administration coming out and say, okay, we're going to regulate an existing technology. We're going to regulate fossil fuels, and we're going to use CCS or hydrogen as our basis for our reduction standard. What's interesting is that I think the EPA might secretly be hoping that, renewables have fallen in cost significantly over the past few years. CCS is still a little expensive. There are some incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act for it, but I think what we'll see a little bit of is generators and states deciding, okay, we're not going to spend the money and invest the money in retrofitting our power plants to install CCS. Instead, we'd rather just retire that power plant entirely and replace it with renewable generation, which is really the best possible outcome.
Yeah, I'm entirely on your page with that. Like, I think given the broader context of the EPA past attempts to regulate the US power sector, this proposed rule leans really heavily into what's realistically possible, knowing the barriers that they've come up against in the past. And there's been a couple press briefings, and in that, the EPA has been very clear on some of those distinctions that this rule is designed to facilitate decisions at the company level and at the state level, and not at that holistic kind of sector approach, because that's what received so much backlash in the 2022 proposal. Um, and I'll say, while I'm obviously biased, they also do a fair job in building in those time horizons of when plants have to comply. There's not actually any requirements until 2030, and the steepest requirements don't kick in until 2035. And just to get a sense, graphically of what that on ramp looks like, in the draft documents, they're estimating a reduction of 10 million metric tons of CO2 in 2028 compared to the prior year. And that sounds like a lot. It's actually less than 1%. It's 0.88% of the current 1,539 metric million tons that's emitted by the power sector last year. So it's really like a very gentle on ramp with steeper reductions on the back half.
Yeah, and when you think about it, 2030 is not that far away, and they're probably building in maybe 2 years to get this proposed rule over the line into becoming a final rule, and then it's 2025, and then, it does seem reasonable to say, okay, now you've got 5 years to meet this standard. So while the majority of the emissions reductions are sort of weighted more into really, really late 2020s and into the 2030s, they are still significant. So as you've mentioned, the goal is to achieve an 80% reduction in emissions from the power sector by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. We're already sitting at about a 36% reduction, which is pretty good. And also, just as a side note, we've actually already achieved the goal of the Clean Power Plan that was struck down last year. We've actually already hit that goal without even needing it. The Inflation Reduction Act, on top of that 36%, is projected to get us to about a 65% reduction by 2030. And so, as you mentioned, this is going to get us pretty close to that 80% mark right around 2030. Or that's the expectation. We're still waiting for a lot of the modeling to come in, but that's the idea. I'm wondering, did the EPA talk at all about their expectations about more plants being retired versus retrofitted? And do they also talk about like how it impacts communities? What are the economic impacts of all of the jobs tied to the fossil fuel economy?
Yeah, they did. So in these press briefings, a lot of this was handled by EPA Administrator Michael Reagan, and he's acknowledging in the rule that the rule, or really the cost of the CCS and technologies required to adhere to the reduction requirements of the rule, is likely going to drive retirement from a lot of coal-fired power plants. And that's why, it's going to be up to the decision, plant by plant. What's your business decision? Do you want to invest in this technology? Do you want to do that? Or do you want to just retire the plant because the end of its useful life is only 15 years away and you're not going to have the opportunity to recoup on your capital investment towards these technologies? And so that's actually one of the examples. There's also a lot of caveats in this. So some of the fine print, like one such example, is that coal plants that commit to retire by 2032 or run at like 20% capacity ahead of the 2035 retirement date aren't required to reduce their emissions. And so they only have to do routine maintenance. And so there's a lot of those kinds of caveats where, when it doesn't make business sense because of the expected life of your facility and investment required for your facility, there's kind of a lot of like outs that hopefully those who would take opposition to a rule like this can acknowledge, in its kind of thoughtful approach. As for the jobs, I like to lean on our old trusty IRA for that. There is so much information and incentives in there. And like, that is what the IRA is. It is about providing funding and incentive packages to develop, deploy, and support climate positive manufacturing and economies, specifically in areas that have historically been dependent on fossil fuels. So I think really exciting that this rule came out. Absolutely need to stay on top of the new modeling and projection, and of course the opposition, and see who comes out against it and how strong those arguments are. But big picture, like some of the big benefits by the numbers for this rule, they're expecting 617 metric tons of carbon dioxide to be removed or really avoided between 2028 and 2042. And that's equal to removing 137 million passenger cars from the road, which, by the way, is half of all the passenger cars in the US. So pretty significant. It's also expected to reduce a lot of other pollution, a lot of the respiratory illness and health concerning pollution, particulate matter, NOx and SOx, all the bad stuff, preventing over 1,300 premature deaths in the US by 2030, and up to $85 billion in benefits from avoided climate change and health impacts. Like, this is clearly the business case. If nothing else
Yeah.
drives you towards climate action, there's the business case and the health and the life case.
Just all around is a great idea. And, it's not as ambitious as we would like, but they're constrained, they're constrained by this old ruling. And so in a way, the EPA seems like they're doing the best they can, or they're doing a very good job at given the constraints.
I agree. We support you, EPA. We are here for you. All right. Well, that's all that we have for you this week. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Sustain.Life is a sustainability management SaaS platform with deep carbon expertise that helps future-proof small and medium-sized enterprises by taking climate action. Go to Sustain.Life to learn more. Thanks for listening and watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next week.